So before I get into doing the actual calculation, there are two measures or two approaches to evaluating a project performance. And it's all based on the amount or whether there's the presence of funding or not, outside financing. One is leveraged, which means that the developer is borrowing money. So they're not paying for the entire development. They're paying the equity portion and then leveraging that to take a loan out for the remainder. You've heard the term other people's money. That's what this is about. Okay? And it reflects how much the developer's risk is in the project. The developer's risk is related to the equity invested. Okay? So that's the leverage side. And that's when you've heard terms like return on equity. That's a term that does take into consideration that we're measuring the project performance based on the equity investment. The other is unleveraged, which means there's no loan involved at all. And developers will do an unleveraged return analysis because it gives them an idea of how well the project will perform independent of any financing that's required. So it's a pure, again, it's going back to the whole idea of equity. Without any, looking at the NOI and looking at the unleveraged, it's providing a sense of the project's cash flows without any consideration for debt. So just, as I said, some developers call this just the pure return. So it'll be lower than the leveraged because the project cost replaces the equity in the denominator. So it's a larger denominator, it's going to be a lower return. So the expectation is unleveraged will have a higher return than the leveraged will have a higher return than the unleveraged. And the measure that's used for that's the rate of return, the ROR. So if I take a look at return on equity, I'm not a big fan of return on equity simply because it's a snapshot at one point in time. We're taking a look at the project based on an individual year's cash flows. We're not looking at the discounted cash flow, which gives a more comprehensive view of the project's performance long term. And based on our analysis of the hypothetical, I have a negative 5.4%. It's called cash on cash as well. And it doesn't take into consideration the value of the asset. That's why it's important to take the NOI divided by the cap rate to come up with a measure. Okay. So this is just a it's just an analysis based at one point in time. It can be used, it's a good, quick and dirty way to figure out how much the project's returning. And it is, if you're looking at something very quickly, you don't want to invest the time in putting together a long-term analysis, it could serve as a good approach. Now let's talk about some of the measures that are used a lot that do take discounted cash flow analysis into account. One that's very prominently used is something called the internal rate of return. Now the internal rate of return is the annualized return for the investment. How much is the project expected to return on an annual basis over the life of the project? And it measures cash flows relative to the equity. And it's called internal rate of return because it's based on the internal cash flows of the development itself. And it takes into consideration the operation cash flow and the asset value appreciation. IRR is used a lot. It's popular because it's a percentage, and people relate to percentages. It's easier to compare a percentage to other percentages. But this is a very commonly used measure. Then there's net present value. Net present value is a little more complicated, but it's used quite a bit as a way to figure out what is the project value worth today relative to the discount rate. Remember I talked about the discount rate. So I want to know how much beyond the discount rate is this project going to generate in revenues or in profits. So if it's positive, it means it exceeds the discount rate, means the developer is getting more than what they set aside for the discount rate. If it's less, that means they're receiving a lesser amount. So we have our discount rate here. So in our pro forma example, I'm not going to go through this. Excel does this for you. Right? That's a nice thing about Excel. I'll put my little push in for Excel at the end, but the leveraged IRR, I'm just going to focus on that, is 10.2%. The MPV at 8% is positive $4 million, 4.4 million. The unleveraged, I do have it here, 6.8 and negative 8. It's a lower IRR for the unleveraged and negative for the NPV because it's lower than, because this is lower than the discount rate, so it's going to be negative. So if I'm looking at this, my benchmark is 10.2% suitable, using the MPV of 8%. If I were to invest my funds at 8%, this is saying I would earn $4.4 million more by investing in this development. So that's what the net present value does. Debt coverage ratio. The debt coverage ratio is what the banks, or the financing side, uses to evaluate the ability of the development to cover the debt. Again, the financing side, they want to make sure that that debt is addressed by the operation cash flow. So they will take the net operating income and divide it by the debt payment. So they want to, the intention is to determine if there's a cushion in place in case there might be a market downturn, if there might be a problem with the building, that it's still generating enough to pay off the loan. So DCR is something that the banks use. So this is the back of the envelope example. This is something that condo, if you're looking at a condo, how might this work? This is based on a development that I had been working on as a policy project, and figure out the revenues up here. So we have a 1-bed, 2-bed, 3-bed condo. This is based on a development in Mississauga a few years ago. So we have gross sales. We took out agent fees, all these other costs associated with selling the condo. And I have the total project revenue of $119,047,173. That's how much the project's expected to generate in revenue. So I need, again, if you're looking at a condo, it doesn't take more than this. I know there are some developers who will do an IRR for a condo because it'll take 2 to 3 years to build, and they're getting money in through deposits on units. So if you want to get more complicated, you can, but I don't think it's really necessary. Then we have the cost side, which is the land, construction, so that's hard, soft, permits, fees. Then we get the development costs, financing, and that's how much it costs to build. So how do we determine a return rate on this? Well, if we're looking at a static one point in time, we don't have the cash flow to go through a discounted cash flow analysis. So we're just going to use revenues relative to cost or profit. And this is what a lot of condo developers use. So we have 119 revenues, we have 99 costs, bless you, and we have 19.2 profit. So the metric that's used is maybe profit relative to revenue. So how much profit am I generating relative to the revenue that I've earned or I've generated through the sales, or profit relative to cost. So when you're looking at a condo, if you want to do a very basic analysis, I would just do revenues, cost, profit, and come up with these, because that's what developers who are building, I saw more condos going up in Calgary. This would be a good way to evaluate what kind of return rate they're getting. Okay. So again, I said you could look at it from a more complicated, extensive process. I don't think it's really necessary. Okay. One other key concept I want to cover is something called the land value residual. Another question I get a lot, again, is this idea of how do we figure out the land value? It's not readily available, if you're dealing with an asset that has a building on it as well. So this is a way that developers use to figure out how much they should pay for the land to go ahead with the development they're considering. So they don't know the land value either. There's a market out there. There's market land value I'll talk about in a second. But essentially, they're trying to figure out how much should they pay for the land based on the proposed development that they're thinking about building on that site. Right? Because it's relative to what is going to go up on the site. Right? So it's not speculative. If they're looking at land value, it's what can it provide in terms of a return. So the land value that's determined through what's called the residual land value is then compared to the market rates to figure out how competitive it would be as an investment. So I'll show you an example. First of all, how to figure out the residual land value. It's the overall project value. So if you're looking to build a certain type of development, take the net operating income from it, divide it by the cap rate, that's how much it's worth. That's how much the developer expects to generate in value for that development. Okay, so now we figure out how much does it cost for the hard cost for the building, how much of the soft cost, we take those out. Then we take out the developer's desired return. And in this case here, it's a percentage of the overall value. And what's left over is the land value, and that's how much the developer is willing to pay for that site. So what they're doing is they're stripping off all of the costs associated with it to figure out, okay, what's left over is the land. So how much should I pay for the land to get my desired return rate? And the valuation is based on highest and best use for the site. So I put together an example here. Developers looking, basic retail plaza, 20,000 square foot site. They're proposing, to put up a development that they figure the NOI is going to be $455,000. Okay, so they went through, they did their cash flow analysis, $455,000. Cap rate 6%. So this gives me a development value of $7.5 or $7.6 million. So now we know how much the value of the proposed development is. Okay. And the developer wants a 15% return. We're saying, okay, we're going in this looking at a 15% return. So we have the value, and these are numbers, again, I'm just putting them up here for discussion. This is the value. Hard cost, $4.5 million. The soft cost, 30% of hard cost, $1.35 million. The developer profit, 15% of the value, which is $1.137 million. So they figured out, these are the things I know. How much should I pay for the land to give me that 15% return? So they take out the hard cost, take out the soft cost, take out the developer profit, and what's left is the land. That's the last cost that needs to be taken into account. And after you do the math, it comes up with $595,833, or about $30 a square foot. So what the developer is saying, based on this, is I will pay $30 a square foot if I can build that retail plaza and get a 15% return. So the value will change based on, the residual will change based on the developer's desired return rate and other factors. So this is a way, and I know developers do this, a very quick way to figure out how much should they pay for that land. So this leads me to the planner's lament. This is, I'm hearing this more as I've been presenting this material more to planners, is we go ahead, we make these great plans, we think developers are going to flock to the site, it's a great opportunity, why aren't they investing? What's going on? Well, it's an issue of land values. For $30 a square foot, the developer is willing to invest. But what happens if the prevailing market at that point is $35 a square foot? They're not going to get it they're not going to get that piece of land for $35 if they're only willing to pay $30. And that's something that needs to be taken into consideration when you look at policies and you're looking at encouraging certain types of investment. What is the land market like? In Toronto, there's been a big discussion about mid-rises on the avenues, 6 to 8 story buildings along major thoroughfares in the city. City passed their initiative, they thought, great. Developers are going to flock and build mid-rises all along our major streets. It wasn't happening because when developers did their residual land value, the land value to build a mid-rise was lower than what the prevailing market rate was. So for example, if it costs $30 a square foot to build a mid-rise, but the market's $35, they're not getting that land. Because if they pay $35, then their return goes down. It's, when you look at different sites in your cities and towns, and you think, boy, why isn't this power center being redeveloped? It's because the residual land value, the return being delivered to the property owner is greater than what can be appreciated from the alternative use, right? So So another thing I encourage you to do is take a look at what's there now and what the value of that is. Not just what you want, but what is there. And does your policy encourage an investment that would exceed the return and that justifies the land value? One last part before I get into resilience. Sensitivity analysis. Sensitivity analysis is a way to evaluate the risk associated with a potential investment. When putting together a pro forma analysis, it's customary not to just look at one scenario. You don't look at, this is what we expect to be built. Taking it the next step is, now that we have our base case, let's start adjusting some key variables to see how the return rates and the project performance responds. Because that's where the measure of risk is, and that's what developers do. They'll take a look at potential investments and say, this is my base case, but what happens if, I have some examples here. What happens if hard costs change? If they have to pay more for hard costs. What happens, and this is one that I'm sure you deal with developers, if development charges and fees go up? How does that impact my feasibility? So that gets incorporated into the analysis. Financing, what happens if interest rates go up? What happens if I can't get a loan to value appropriate to provide the equity I need, that I can provide? What happens to market revenues? What happens if the market softens? So if you're anticipating building a development office that generates $20 a square foot, well, what happens if there's a bit of a softening in the market and it's only $18 a square foot? If vacancies are 5%, what happens if the market softens and vacancies go up to 10%? So it's a way to start manipulating the pro forma to come up with alternative outcomes. Land use I have in there as well, because it's something that, discussions we have is certain land uses that are desirable. I've been doing work in Toronto on employment lands, industrial lands. They're getting priced out because the market is starting to bid up the land and it's more viable to sell to other uses, but we have protections in Toronto through the Ontario Growth Plan, the places to grow, so it's not happening as rapidly, but in other areas it is happening. That's why industrial land gets bid out of the market. So here are just some scenarios. If my base case is 10.2%, okay, what happens if the market gets better? It goes up to 21 bucks, this goes up in value. If it goes down to 19, that's where the risk is. So the developer wants to understand what's the risk associated with it. Same with density. If they get a density bonus, it goes up. What happens if there's downzoning? So it goes from 10.2 to 5.7. So just a way to assess the impact of planning measures on development outcomes is useful as well. And I always encourage planners, when you're looking at development charge changes, we can get in a whole discussion about what DCs are used for and the appropriateness of them. They serve a function, but just on their own, because the developer's looking at the pro forma, how does it impact the return rate? Okay, so I just want to talk quickly. I wanted to include something about resilience, and just to give you a sense of how you might look at resilience in a pro forma. And I'm under the assumption we're looking at a private asset, and we're trying to figure out what actions could provide the incentive necessary for developers to deliver a desired outcome. Okay. And it is about risk, because we talk about risk. Resilience is about flexibility. Resilience is about adaptability. And developers like to focus on certainty. Right? So if you start talking about these different potential blips, they might be a little concerned about it. And also, resilience is long-term. Right? Resilience returns aren't usually appreciated in a short term, so that's why using a discounted cash flow is useful for a long-term analysis. And also joint ventures, developers are getting more involved with municipalities and provinces and the public sector in participating in projects, so it's useful to look at it from that perspective as well. So how can resilience impact a pro forma? If we have a pro forma, well, hard costs may go up because the new technologies come into play that may be a little more expensive. So that might be one factor to take into consideration, new materials. Soft costs may go up because dealing with new experts, experts have, they haven't been incorporated into their process before, so maybe there is a need for a sustainability person now, and that might increase the cost. Interest accrued, the project may take longer to complete because of some resilience measures now. And that's one concern developers do raise, is that the length of time it takes to get a project approved has an impact on their returns. And revenue generation may decrease. It's not the highest and best use. As I said, we're talking about long-term development that will encourage a nice mix of uses that may not necessarily meet the highest and best use. Building efficiency might reduce the revenue generating potential of the site. And buildable land reduction may occur as well if we start taking parts of the site, basically hiving it off to preserve for environmental reasons. So I'm going to go really quickly through this. So we're looking at how can we impact on the planning side, how can you impact a developer's return? Well, there are factors that really can't be changed through the planning process. Land costs are land costs determined by the market. Hard costs are determined by prevailing market conditions. Soft costs for professional services are set pretty much. Financing between the developer and the lending institution. Revenues, again, based on market conditions. Operating costs are pretty well set. And the developer's return target. And developers have a target in mind. If they don't meet it, they're probably not likely to invest. So what does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us with municipal fees and charges. That's something developers talk about a lot, and that's a variable factor that can be adjusted through planning. The approval process, again, that's something else. And density. Those are just 3 examples. Right, so that's to offset the potential costs associated with the resilience measure. So the objective is to use the pro forma as a way to evaluate what can be done to encourage the type of investment necessary to achieve the desired outcomes, and understanding what can be manipulated through the pro forma. So what are some of the outcomes? Well, it could be reduced returns through resilience measures. Right? They're not going to generate as much return as they wanted to or could before if there weren't these resilience measures in place. And that could also impact the capitalization rate, which then turns into overall market conditions. It could increase the debt required if there are costs up front, because the upfront hard costs and soft costs, financing costs get folded into the permanent loan. The permanent loan increases in value. If the revenue generation doesn't change, you're going to be left with essentially a smaller NOI to cover the debt. So what are we looking for? We're looking for incentives that could offset the revenue and cost gap there. We could reduce upfront costs. I mentioned waiver, deferral, development fees, providing grants, the expedited processing, or increase the revenue side. So this is on the construction development side, and this is on the operation side. So just different ways that you could look at generating the offsets necessary to close that gap. So here I'm going to go through a real quick example here. Here's our base case scenario. We have hard, soft, and land costs. This is how much it's going to generate in operation cash flow. And that's our 10.2% return. That's how much we're going to make based on our hypothetical office building. Okay. So let's say through some resilience measures, hard cost goes up 10%. So what's going to happen there is we have a 10% increase. That's going to decrease the return by 1.3% down to 8.9%. So the investor will say, well, if I'm going to contribute more here, how do you make up that gap? And I mentioned before, this is the way to make up the gap. Because that's what will happen. These costs will create an additional amount of, it will decrease the return. So ways to look at it, as I mentioned, the upfront support or something in the operation side. Another way to do it is to figure out how much density could be granted to offset that, to generate the revenues necessary to bring back that 1.3% increase. So I looked at our hypothetical example. It started with an FSI of 5. And I said, okay, if I increase my FSI by 0.4, I'll get that 1.3% back. And that's using the pro forma as a way to figure out. I also like it because it gives you a better sense of what's appropriate as opposed to throwing out 6, 7 FSI. You have a better sense of what would be an appropriate FSI to cover that developer's costs. I just want to go through, because I do a lot of work in housing, an example of how this could be used to evaluate how pro forma could be used in a housing policy context. So we want to encourage a certain type of housing construction. Affordability is one example. We're going to use, the best way to approach it is to do the baseline, the base scenario, and then figure out the pro forma, through the pro forma, what's necessary to encourage the investment necessary to provide the housing through the private sector, and yet get that private sector the return they're looking for or they're desiring. I'm using an example. It was a studio project we did at Ryerson a few years ago. Grad studio group was approached by York Region, north of Toronto. They weren't getting a lot of rental housing being built in York Region. A lot of younger people were moving up there, a lot of jobs up there, and they couldn't find places to live because they weren't in a position to own, or they didn't want to own. So they asked the students, could you figure out what can we do in terms of incentives to encourage more rental? So they came up with a base case based on 3 different scenarios. High density along the major corridors, medium density around some of the centers, and then lower density in the lower density northern municipalities. They came up with a baseline, okay, based on a 15% return. That's what they're trying to get to. They figured out high, medium, low density. Based on market conditions, if I wanted to build rental, these would be my return rates. So then the next step was, okay, then what's the rent necessary to come up with 15%? So they had the pro forma. They figured out what needed to be done to make it 15%. Okay. I also like using the student example because a lot of material is proprietary, and they ask you to scrub it down and not provide you with the numbers. This was okay. York Region's okay with this being out there. So you looked at a variety of incentives, regulatory incentives, financial incentives, municipal tools, and they plugged them into the pro forma to see how much would it take to bring up to these desired return rates. And again, these are density bonuses, TEAGs, which are property tax offsets. Let's go through this. I'm just going to really go through this quickly. They said, okay, if we had a density bonus, how much would it increase IRR for the different scenarios? Parkland dedication fee, which is in Ontario, a fee that's required of developments put aside for parks. Parking reduction was a big one, especially in high density. If they reduced parking by 0.7 spaces per unit, the IRR went 3.65%. Right, so this is a way to use the pro forma to figure out how much of what's necessary to deliver the desired outcome. And they have a few others here. I'm not going to go through them all, but the one developers like to talk about property tax waivers down here. If they waived the regional and local, the developer in the low density went up 4.35%. So this was a way they took the pro forma and they just manipulated it to figure out what needed to be done to achieve the outcome they were looking for. So they came up here with a couple of different scenarios and what needed to be done. This was the base case, and when they put in these different incentives, these were the IRRs they wound up with. It was a very good project. In fact, York Region hired a consultant to verify this, and it is serving as the basis for some policy moving forward, so I was very proud of them. There are different publications out there that do provide you an idea of how much how these different measures may impact feasibility. There's one put out by this organization here, and they looked at green revenues, and they figured out that there is an actual sale premium associated with LEED and green buildings. There's a savings in operation costs. There's a premium associated with rents. Tenants were more interested in living or renting in buildings that had LEED or green standards to them. So that became something, something to look for. I'm just going to close with 2 quick things. If you're working in a municipality, you do hire consultants to do this work for you, it's great. You should have an understanding of how they've come up with their determinations. But I also encourage people to develop some kind of proficiency in Excel. And I mentioned this, and people groan sometimes. it's something that's on your taskbar at the bottom there. You know, you just go here. You put, I'm trying, I can't find it. You know, don't let it evade you. Don't let it get away from you. You can capture it. You know, I want you to be able, you know, when you look at it, you think, I can't get it. Better off, I don't need to click on it. So, you know, so just use that. And in closing, I just think you should have use pro formas as a way to understand how planning initiatives and planning decisions impact feasibility. Use the pro forma as that for the basis of that. Understand the market. You know, developers are going to talk about the market all the time. Know what the cap rates are, know what the rents are, know what units are selling for. And just being able to understand a pro forma is a useful skill. I know my students have told me that when they've started working, it's been very helpful for them. And they can see how it comes into play, and they really enjoy the course. And I teach, and basically that's feasibility, pro forma analysis, and